Well, there's no question that he understands what's going on, and I don't have particular insight to Ukrainian intelligence, but if you're at war with Moscow, this has got to be glaringly obvious. And if you remember when Zelensky first visited the White House with Trump, and they sort of ambushed him, and J.D. Vance was it was like he was punishing a schoolboy. Why don't you wear a tie? Thank you. I mean, it was just who talks like that to a head of state of the largest country in Europe, Ukraine. And that's the way they were dealing. And I'm sure he knows everything that was going on. I think he's been pretty savvy about how to deal with it, but he's been dealt a very, very tough hand. So, I don't really know how this will play out at this stage.
Hello and welcome to The Universe is Curious. I am Devi. In this first episode, I speak with investigative journalist Craig Unger, author of the books House of Trump, House of Putin, and American Kompromat. Unger's reporting traces Donald Trump's decades-long relationships with Russian oligarchs, mafia networks, and intelligence-linked figures, and advances the striking argument that the current president of the United States is in fact a Russian asset who has been cultivated over the span of 40 years in what he calls one of the greatest intelligence operations in history. According to Unger, Trump is effectively Putin's man in the White House. This conversation comes at a critical moment. A wave of explosive reporting, including major investigations by the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and Bloomberg, has raised urgent questions about the real forces shaping the Ukraine peace negotiations and whether Trump's positions are being driven by Russian financial incentives and proposals designed mainly by the Kremlin to favor Russia. On the 28th of November 2025, the Wall Street Journal reports that the real motivation behind Trump's push for the Ukraine peace deal is not peace, but profit. Russia has allegedly offered billions in potential business for Trump and his inner circle. These incentives, the Wall Street Journal argues, are driving Trump to pressure Ukraine into accepting a settlement involving major concessions, including territorial losses and military restrictions. The report writes that this reflects a remarkable story of business leaders working outside the traditional lines of diplomacy to cement a peace agreement with business deals. On the 26th of November 2025, Reuters revealed that the US-backed 28-point peace plan was largely shaped by a Russian-authored proposal submitted directly to the Trump administration. On the 25th of November 2025, Bloomberg published 2 leaked phone transcripts showing how the Trump administration was coordinating with Moscow on the peace plan. In the first call, dated 14 October 2025, Trump envoy Steve Witkoff advised Putin aide Yuri Ushakov on how best to pitch a plan to Trump, assuring him that Trump would grant him the, quote, space and discretion to move the deal forward. In the second call, dated 29 October 2025, Ushakov and Kirill Dmitry, Kremlin's lead negotiator and head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, a sovereign wealth fund established to attract foreign investment into Russia, discussed Witkoff's advice on how to approach Trump and confirmed that the Trump-backed peace plan had been mainly crafted by Moscow. In the call, economic advisor Dmitriev even says, according to the transcript, quote, I don't think they'll take exactly our version, but at least it'll be as close to it as possible, unquote. The leaks triggered an international uproar, appearing to show Witkoff coaching the Kremlin on how to handle Trump and secure a settlement that would heavily favor Russia. With negotiations ongoing and no Ukraine-approved deal in sight, this is a decisive moment to examine Trump's long-standing ties to Moscow and their potential influence on the peace process. In today's episode, we explore how Craig Unger's investigations illuminate these developments, what they may signal about the forces shaping current relations between America and Russia, and how the newest revelations might support the claim that President Donald Trump is, as Unger argues, operating as a cultivated Russian asset. So Craig, before we get into the substance, I'd love to hear your first reaction when you saw this latest wave of reporting. Did anything surprise you Or did it feel like a continuation of the patterns you've been tracking for decades?
Well, the actual U.S. position didn't surprise me at all. As I have said for years, Trump is a Russian act. Now we see it being played out. The one thing that surprised me is some right-wing publications, like the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, actually have some good people, reporters who really confirmed my theory. And I think we're seeing it play out as time goes on in terms of, I hate hearing it called the Russian peace plan because it's not a peace plan, the Ukraine peace plan, because it's not a peace plan. It is very much a deal to make Putin happy and probably give some money, whether it's in rare earth metals or whatever, to Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump.
So, can you walk us through how Russian intelligence first identified Donald Trump, why he was considered useful, and how the cultivation evolved over time?
Right. Well, one thing that's really important to understand is that the Russian mafia is very different from the American mafia, where you'd always see the Italian mafia at war with the FBI. In Russia, the mafia is really an adjunct to Russian intelligence. So I've done two books. One, The House of Trump, House of Putin, is really how he started the Russian mafia first came to Donald Trump and started wooing him. And American Kompromat is how the KGB started. And all of this goes back more than 40 years to 1980 is when it really starts. And you see the Russians trying to woo Donald Trump. It's important to understand, too, what an asset is. An intelligence asset is very different from an agent. An intelligence agent is an employee of an intelligence agency. He or she would know that they're employed. They get paychecks. They're on the payroll, and they can be tasked with specific operations that they have to perform. An asset is a friend. And it's a loose kind of relationship that involves trust and the trading of favors. And that's the way it started off with Donald Trump. And the Russians were not specifically looking only for him and thinking, oh, we will cultivate him over 40 years and he'll become president. That's not what was happening. What was happening is the Russians were going after 300 or 400 Americans they wanted to cultivate as assets or agents. One of them was Donald Trump. And as time went on, they reeled him in, both with help from the Russian mafia, which is what I dealt with first, and also with the KGB.
And you emphasize vulnerabilities, financial, reputational, personal. You also say that Trump would respond. Trump is the kind of guy, when you talk about money, he responds. And that's how the Russian were able to gradually cultivate him over time. So I want to focus on the money connection, but also other possible sources of kompromat, like the sexual activities of Trump, especially when he visited in the 1980s. You mentioned that the KGB is known to bug hotels that high-profile visitors stay in when they visit Moscow, and Trump might have been is very probably among those high-profile visitors that the KGB. But so I want to focus on how you emphasize vulnerabilities, financial, reputational, personal, and which of these vulnerabilities created the most enduring leverage on Trump in your view?
Right. Well, one of my sources for American Kompromat was a KGB station in Washington where he was recruiting American spies to spy for the Soviet Union against the United States. So a lot of my information comes from him. But one of the first, and when you look at Trump as a personality, I mean, one thing about him, I don't know if everyone can agree on this, but he is utterly shameless. I mean, nothing can embarrass him. So, and if you accuse him of something, he'll shove it back in your face. He will deny, and then just move on to the next subject. That's part of who he is. He was coached by Roy Cohn, who was sort of the great dark satanic prince of the American right wing, and that was Donald Trump's lawyer. And he was also lawyer for all the Italian mafia families in New York City. So that was a formative experience for Donald Trump. And when you look at that and look at how he dealt with money, for example, in 1984, he had just built Trump Tower, this glitzy, gaudy monument to conspicuous consumption that was his home. And he'd gotten enormous amounts of publicity. And in 1984, a year after it was built, a man named David Bogatin, who was part of the Russian mafia, came into Trump Tower, met with Donald Trump, and put down $6 million in cash. And he said, I'll take 5 condos. He was buying 5 condos. One of the things that was going on here was, I mean, and this is, I've written 6 books on the erosion of our checks and balances. And if you look at the real estate industry, the regulations are just pathetically weak. And it's a terrific way to launder money. If you've got a couple of $1 billion you want to clean from sex trafficking or gambling or drug cartels or whatever, all you have to do is set up an LLC, a limited liability corporation, which is easy to do. I have one for my books that I do, and it costs like $50, and anyone can do it. But you can do it anonymously. You can set up an anonymous corporation, and then you make an all cash transaction. In this case, who knows where they got it from? They were doing pump and dump stock scandals. The Russian mafia was. There were sex trafficking and drug cartels and so forth. But he comes in with $6 million in cash. That's at nearly $30 million in today's dollars, because this is over 20 years ago. No, 40 years ago, I'm sorry. And all Trump has to do is not ask, gee, where'd that money come from? And bam, he has deniability. He can say, gee, how did I know where his money came from? And bam, the money is laundered once that transaction is, because the mafia can simply sell the apartment. If they're asked where the money came, it came from their real estate properties. So that's the way it really started off with the Russian mafia.
Right. And that it starts with a really easy, innocent conversations. That's what you say in your book. That's how the KGB starts cultivating those relationships. And then as they get more information about the target, what are his preferences, what are his weak points, they start getting the ball rolling on that. In your view, how important was the money connection that they could get Donald Trump they could rope him in by the sheer power of money and lucrative deals and the ability to launder billions actually of Russian mafia money?
Right. Well, it was enormously important because I think people have the wrong idea about Donald Trump as a businessman. He was a lousy businessman. He had 6 bankruptcies. He was $4 billion in debt. He was finished, and the Russian mafia saved him. So if you look at it started with the kind of money laundering I just described. As it happened in Trump Tower, I found 13 members of the Russian mafia who either owned condos there or lived there. They were also laundering money by going out to his casinos in Atlantic City, which is just an hour away from New York. And casinos are a great way to launder money as well. You just buy chips and bam, you've laundered, you cash in your chips and you've laundered the money. So this was a hugely important thing. It's also, to me, a huge national security breach, because here you have people in the Russian mafia who are living in Trump Tower, which is the home of the President of the United States, and they are all tied to Russian intelligence. So this was a huge security breach as well.
Right. And you mentioned that you spoke to who was in the KGB. And last year, as Trump got elected for the second time president, he came out with claim that Trump is a Russian asset, started circulating online. And based on your conversations with Yuri Shvets, were you able to get an idea of how the KGB understands how money is important for Trump?
Absolutely. And I mean, with the KGB, it started even before the Russian mafia. And I think the very first contact was in 1980. And at the time, Donald Trump had just developed the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is right adjacent to Grand Central Station. And as he was building the hotel, like any hotel, hotels need television sets in every room. And you would think a big franchise like the Hyatt would get their TV sets from a major vendor like Samsung or Sony or something like that. Instead, Trump bought them from an electronics store called Joy Ludd Electronics. And it was owned by 2 men, Semyon Kislin and Damir Sapir, both of whom had ties to Russian intelligence. And according to Yuri Shvets, Sem was a spotter agent for the KGB. That is, his job was to find potential intelligence assets. So with Donald Trump, he approached him and said, I can make you a really good deal for all your TV sets you need. And Trump was pleased to get, money, money, money. So Trump was sort of seduced by that. And it was followed up by meetings with people tied to the Russian mission to the United Nations. A woman named Natalia Dubinina and her father, Yuri Dubinin, who her father was ambassador first to the United Nations and then to the ambassador to the United States. And they had lunch with Trump. They started flattering him. I mean, that's another part of Trump's character that makes him so susceptible to being wooed by Russian intelligence. He loves to be flattered. He's a narcissist. I mean, if you want to, you just say something nice about how nice his hair looks, he'll smile and be delighted. I mean, that's what they started to do. And they said how much they loved a Trump Tower. And Russia really needed something like that in Moscow on Red Square near the Kremlin or something, a big Trump Tower. And if you were familiar at all with the history of the Cold War, that is absolutely insanely ridiculous. At the time, tensions were very, very high between the United States and the Soviet Union did not want a monument to conspicuous consumption, to capitalism on Red Square. That was insane. And yet Trump was flattered enough to go along with it. And they suggested he come to Moscow. There was a trip that was arranged by the KGB. If your trip was booked, by the agency known as Intourist, that was a front for the KGB. So this was Trump's very, very first trip to Moscow in 1987. And that's where he started to be really recruited. And I think I hate to use a term like brainwashed, but he was sort of indoctrinated with the talking points that the Soviet Union wanted him to put forth in America.
Now, Craig, how did these financial and business connections contribute to Trump's political rise? And how might they be shaping current US diplomatic actions, including the Ukraine peace plan?
Well, they contributed enormously. I mean, one is Trump was bankrupt. He was a failure. I mean, and that's one way of looking at it. People don't really seem to know that widely. But in New York, where I lived for more than 45 years, he was sort of the laughing stock. He was a very gaudy, garish, sort of Las Vegas, Atlantic City kind of guy. He would call up gossip columnists, the tabloid papers, and say he was dating this or that hot babe, and he was a joke. But the Russians kept backing him up again and again and again. It's unclear exactly what they were getting at it from this early on, but the way Russian intelligence works is it takes the long view. It takes the view of the next 40 years. And they cultivated him again and again. I do a Substack, and it's just under my name called Craig Unger. But part of it is a Trump-Russia timeline, and I show step by step by step. I have, I think, 33 or 34 stories at this point in chronological order, and you can see exactly how they're helping him out and what he gets out of it. So he becomes tied more and more closely to Russia. Eric Trump, his son, said, where do you go? This was during the banking crisis when no banks would give any loans. And you have to remember, Trump has defaulted on his loans again and again. And Eric Trump said, oh, it's no problem for us. We get all our money from Russia. So a lot of the Trump golf courses started out that way. And as I say, I have at least 34 episodes. These are not small contributions, by the way. If you look at the Trump Soho, which was backed by Russian money, and 77% of it was anonymous buyers. And if you are looking for money laundering, red alarm bells should be going off. This is something that is built to launder money. And Trump started doing it all over the world, in Kazakhstan, in Toronto, in Soho, New York, in Florida, in Panama. And half of these projects went belly up or they had to change their names. That happened in Toronto. So he was deeply, deeply indebted to it. And he kept saying, and it wasn't until I think 1999 that Putin became president, but he automatically fell in love with Vladimir Putin.
Right. Now, we see that Trump's Russian connections, according to your observations, do shape how he is handling the Ukraine peace deal. And I want to focus on something, on a person rather, the appointment of Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's special envoy to negotiate the Ukraine peace deal. Now, this is a lawyer turned a real estate developer, just like, well, Trump was not a lawyer, but he's a real estate developer. And Steve Witkoff has substantial business ties to Russian investors and some would say the Russian mafia. According to you, now we must remember that Steve Witkoff is someone with no previous diplomatic experience, but he has business ties to Moscow. Now, according to you, what does this reveal about the influence of private business interests and possibly hidden factors shaping how the US is dealing with the whole thing in getting Ukraine to sign a peace deal?
To Trump, the only thing that matters are his business interests in this. I mean, as you say, Steve Witkoff has less diplomatic experience than our pet cat. I mean, there's no diplomatic experience whatsoever. He was a very successful, or is a very successful real estate developer. He owns, among other things, the Woolworth building in New York, which is one of our great architectural gems. He also owned the New York Daily News building, which is another very wonderful Art Deco building. But again, he has absolutely no diplomatic experience. He's also a golfing buddy of Trump's, and Trump put him in there to make business deals. And I don't know exactly how this business deal will come out, but you do know that Ukraine has some rare earth metals that could be very valuable. There's also the question of Russian oil. I mean, through all of this, if Trump was really wanted to stop the Ukraine, he would have fully sanctioned Russian oil, and he has not. So there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of money to be made. I don't know exactly how this will parse itself out, but that is driving things. Trump doesn't care at all, nor does Witkoff care about the Ukrainian people. And you can see it I mean, I saw Witkoff being interviewed once, and he didn't know the Ukrainian regions in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbass, that Russia was trying to take over. He didn't know their names. And that's like not knowing, if you've never heard of California, that's the equivalent. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
And I'll point out the Wall Street Journal article, "Make Money Not War," which claims that business opportunities in Russia for people close to Trump may be actually what's driving his eagerness to pressure Ukraine into an unfavorable settlement. So, for someone who's been observing these things, how does this fit with the patterns of influence you describe in your work? How Russia tries to use the prospect of money and business opportunities to get Trump to do what they would like him to do.
Well, it's exactly what I have reported, and I mean, it's really sort of interesting if you look how Russia's earlier attempts to take over Ukraine, and one of the ways they did it was they hired an American lobbyist, Paul Manafort, who actually did engineer the Russian takeover of the Ukraine when he helped get President Yanukovych elected as president. I mean, Yanukovych was a Putin puppet, and they did it from the inside. And Paul Manafort was effectively an agent of Russia. He was paid $75 million. His lobbying firm was paid $75 million by the Russians. He worked closely with a Russian intelligence operative named Konstantin Kilimnik, who was sort of mini-me. Kilimnik was about 5 feet tall. Manafort is over 6 feet tall, and they went around dressed in very similarly. But they were effectively doing the work of Vladimir Putin to install Yanukovych as president. And in 2014, of course, the Ukrainian people rose up, and we had Euromaidan, which overthrew Yanukovych, and he fled Kyiv to end up in exile in Russia.
Right. So that issue of how Russia is using its ties with Trump to get a peace deal that's favorable to Russia. What do you make of this recent report by Reuters that the US-backed 28-point peace plan drew from a Russian-authored proposal submitted to the Trump administration? That's basically saying Musk wrote a plan of what he would like to see, and then Trump takes that plan and then incorporates its content into a peace proposal that it makes to Ukraine. Does that surprise you? Do you think what's going on here?
I'm sometimes surprised that it's so naked and so obvious, but I would be surprised. I would be stunned if Trump did anything that helped Ukraine win a favorable outcome. I know that is absolutely not going to happen. I mean, there are times when you wonder about Trump, and it's, he's constantly, he's an incredibly transactional man. He goes from one deal to another. And at a certain point, one could see that perhaps he wasn't going along to Putin. But a lot of that is theater. I mean, he's not a reliable narrator of anything really anymore at this stage. I mean, in fact, he's become quite old and decrepit at this point, but he has behind him people who have bought into his program because they will benefit from it one way or another.
Right. And when you look at the dynamics of the peace deal, and especially, I mean, you look at how Putin and Moscow has been behaving throughout, Putin doesn't seem like a guy who thinks he's not going to get what he wants. So, and Putin has said he's not going to budge on the propositions that he's made to Trump on how on what he wants to see in that deal. So, what do you see happening to that deal? Does Ukraine get pressured? Does Trump pressure Ukraine into accepting something that Ukraine shouldn't accept? What's going on really here? How do you see that playing out? What's going to happen? Are we going to get a deal?
One of the things we're leaving out of the equation is Europe. And part of this, and what's so horrifying to me, is that this is the end of the Western alliance. And if you go back to World War II, I think one of the few things the United States and the West has ever done well, it was the way we ended World War II. And that is we built strong economic market economies in all of Western Europe. We built strong democratic institutions throughout Western Europe. And we built a strong military alliance with NATO. And I know most Americans don't care or think about NATO whatsoever. But this Western alliance was successful and helpful for all of us. I mean, we had a good trade partnerships, free trade, and Trump is sort of tearing that all up. 80 years of success, and he's throwing it away. And the question is, can Europe come to Ukraine's aid? And normally, one would think you would just go to NATO, and Article 5 in NATO means that when one member of NATO is attacked, all members of a NATO are attacked, and the alliance comes into a fore. And that's a very, very, very powerful alliance so long as the United States is a reliable partner. But the United States is no longer a reliable partner. So that alliance is sort of in shreds right now. Europe has to step up to the fore. In the end of World War II, most of Europe was demilitarized, and the United States was really the only really, really powerful force. It was overwhelmingly more powerful than almost all of Europe combined. But now we have to see, will Europe step up to the plate and take the place of the United States? And that's an open question. I don't know what's going to happen with that.
Okay. And you must have seen the recent headlines that when Trump released his national security strategy, just yesterday, Moscow commented on that strategy, saying that it largely aligns with Moscow's vision of what should be and what the United States should do with regards to Europe. And I should point out that in that strategy document, Trump berates Europe and talks about civilizational erasure and does not hide the fact that it wants regime change in the governments of Europe, and he wants them to move to the, what some would say, even the far right spectrum. So for you, someone who's been watching those, how Trump relates to Moscow, and when you see just yesterday, Moscow saying that Trump's new strategy, which really takes a hammer on the Western alliance that has led the world after the Second World War. Well, according to you, what's the real reaction in Moscow?
They're dancing in the streets. And I mean, part of this to me is, and the reason I'm not surprised by all this, because if you go back nearly 40 years to 1987, when Trump returned from Moscow for the very, very first time, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. And if you read it today, it's almost reads like a first draft of the national security strategy that was issued last week, and about how we have our allies to blame. In the 1987 ad he took out, he puts more of the emphasis on Japan than on Europe. But in effect, even back then, he was putting forth KGB talking points. Yuri Svitz was my source on this. And he had been a spy for the Soviet Union during those years. And he was in Yasinayevo at the headquarters for the KGB counterintelligence. And they got a cable from their active measures department saying, we've had a very, very successful from a new American operative. And they showed the full-page ad that Donald Trump had written in the New York Times. So they saw him as an operative back then, nearly 40 years ago. And that's why none of this surprises me so much.
It must sometimes feel surreal to Moscow that this whole operation paid off so handsomely. There's that aspect of things. I mean, how does Moscow handle this immense bombshell that it cultivated Trump?
It's an open secret in a way. I mean, I remember, and I opened House of Trump this way, was as the results from the 2016 election came in, showing that Trump won in the Dumas, the Russian parliament. They, his last name was, he was the grandson of Molotov cocktail fame, but he hit the gavel and said, I have an announcement to make, and I'm delighted to say that Donald Trump is the new American president. We have our man in Washington, and everyone cheered and applauded. So it was pretty clear to people, anyone who is closely following the Kremlin, that he was their man, and they're thrilled by it.
Right. And I'm going to ask you a very simple question, which I think that hasn't been asked yet, is, do you think President Zelensky understands that Trump may be functioning as a Russian asset?
Oh,
and if he does, how is that likely shaping how Ukraine is negotiating the peace deal and its whole approach to the peace talks?
Well, there's no question that he understands what's going on. And I don't have particular insight to Ukrainian intelligence, but if you're at war with Moscow, this has got to be glaringly obvious. And if you remember, when Zelensky first visited the White House with Trump, and they sort of ambushed him, and J.D. Vance was like it was like he was punishing a schoolboy. Why don't you wear a tie? Say thank you. It was just, who talks like that to a head of state of the largest country in Europe, Ukraine? And that's the way they were dealing. And I'm sure he knows everything that was going on. I think he's been pretty savvy about how to deal with it, but he's been dealt a very, very tough hand. So, I think they've got to be thinking, how long will Trump be in power? Will this always be the case? I don't think Trump is terribly easily changed on this. I mean, I'm not saying it's 100% impossible, but he knows where his bread is buttered. And in November, and that's a long way away, we will have our midterm elections. And if that happens and the Democrats win, I think this is real crucial in terms of how things will play out here in America. Because normally, and right now, one would think the Democrats should easily win the midterm elections and take over Congress. And that shouldn't be very difficult. But the Republicans already made it clear that they are going to play very, very dirty. And they're doing this, it may seem inside baseball if you're not an American, but in Texas, for example, they've redistricted things. And so it's virtually impossible for any Democrat to win a seat because all the congressional districts have been gerrymandered so that Black voters who are traditionally Democratic basically can't possibly win any single district. It's because it's carved up into so many different things. That's happening all over the country. And right now, I don't know how that will play out. People are getting angrier and angrier at Trump. I suspect the No Kings movement is growing. I'm reasonably certain there'll be another mass march before the next midterms, nearly a year from now. At the same time, Trump is playing around with the military, and he's gotten American troops in Los Angeles, in Washington, in Portland, Oregon, where they can conceivably have Americans shooting Americans.
Right.
This is completely unconstitutional, but I would be surprised if it did not erupt into violence before the next midterms, in which case Trump might activate the Insurrection Act, and that would enable him to do all sorts of things and perhaps manipulate the elections to his advantage. But I mean, this goes to your question about Zelensky. If the Democrats could take over Congress, perhaps they could get the Pentagon again to start sending weapons to Ukraine, but it's going to be a real big battle.
Craig Unger, thank you so very much for joining us today. Your books, House of Trump, House of Putin, and American Kompromat are linked in the episode description, and that's for our listeners. I am Devi, and this is The Universe is Curious. Thank you all for listening.